And hello, everybody. I'm John O'Loughlin. Welcome to McDuff Lives, and welcome also to Harley Schlanger, who's back for another interview with me. He's been so generous over the past couple of years. I can't thank you enough, Harley, for making time for us among your many, many endeavors and busy schedules. So, welcome, and how are you this morning?
I'm fine. The real question is, how are you coming back off your vacation?
Oh my goodness. I have to say I had a wonderful birthday. My wife and I went down to Blowing Rock, North Carolina, visited my old college roommate Ted and his wife, and we just took it easy. I went out to dinner, but the main thing is to just get away, for 4 days, and they call it recreation because we have to kind of recreate who we are after getting, we get exhausted with this stuff, and you and I, we and this crowd, we deal with some really, really heavy stuff. So it's wearing, but to get away to the mountains and see some beautiful scenery and enjoy some old friends, well, that's what I call a good vacation.
Sounds pretty good to me.
Well, Harley, we once again uh, have a lot on the plate this morning. If you don't mind, I want to start where I was yesterday because I found myself really disturbed about considering the the Israeli um, uh, participation in some ways in the events of the past, since World War II. Um, I interviewed David Martin, who's written a number of books. The most recent one, The Assassination of James Forrestal. Before that, a book on the assassination of, so-called assassination of Vince Foster. And the big theme that came out of the conversation for me was that there is likely some Mossad involvement in assassinations that have gone on during this period. I found in his book a quote from David Ben Gurion about how he opposed assassinations, that is not the Jewish way, and we're not going to go that way. But then another quote later saying, well, after the Holocaust, the only real question is it good for the Jews? And the implication is that they've taken the gloves off and that they're going to, use the Machiavellian Sun Tzu tactics and, you know, uh, well, face it, the so-called motto of the Mossad to win by deception, that implies a willingness to just cross all moral boundaries as long as it is good for the state of Israel. And I hate to ask about that, but it's just lingering in my mind right now. We speak about Great Britain as, the great Satan of the great, well, America, of course, has that title, but the great center of evil, the ring that controls all the rings in Lord of the Rings terms, and yet, what is Israel's role? Are they simply providing services for the Great British Empire, or is there some uh, other way to characterize the relationship? Is Israel a sovereign state? Are they running other countries' sovereignties or hiding behind puppets to run other countries? In other words, um, you have a lot of perspective on this, and I'd really like to hear what you have to say about the role of Israel in some of the darker events of the past 50, 60 years.
Well, I think to get at your question, you have to go back to the excuse me, the relationship between the British Empire and the creation of Israel. And for much of the history of Israel after 1947-48, at least for the first 20 or so years, it was functioning more or less as a British operation. Now, what was it that went into the creation of Israel? I come from a family background of Eastern European Jews, some from Poland, some from Germany, some from Russia. And most of them wanted to stay in those countries and be productive. I'm talking now about my great-grandparents, but they couldn't because in some cases they were targeted by pogroms. And when you target populations with that kind of terror, which by the way is not so different from what Israel is doing to the Palestinians now, you create a reaction, either a victimization or a nasty anger that can strike out, and you can create terrorists. Now, what happened with my family is they came to the United States. They didn't want to go to Israel. It was not that easy to convince Russian Jews and Eastern European Jews to go to Israel. It took the end of World War II, the Holocaust and the atrocities there, for the British to convince people that Palestine is a place to go. So you have to start with that to understand that a large part of the population that became Israelis, that was not necessarily their first choice. Of course, they wanted to be out of the concentration camps after the war, out of the displaced persons centers, but they weren't allowed to go to Britain or the United States or even France. So there's a very fascinating book by an Israeli historian named Tom Segev, Segev, called The Seventh Million. And what he writes about is the Jews who, after the war, were sent to Israel, and the psychological trauma that they had gone through, and the split within them between those who adhered to what you were referring to earlier, the Ben-Gurion type moderate tradition, which was, well, if no one else will take us, we'll build our own state, as opposed to a much more darker grouping, the Jabotinsky network, the so-called revisionist Jews, who worked with the Nazis. They were part of Jabotinsky wrote to Hitler and said, I am a fascist. I agree with you on most things. If you were to work with us, I'm sure many Jews would support you. That's why Ben-Gurion called him Vladimir Hitler. But Jabotinsky created the organization that became the Herut and then the Likud, the Israelis who were part of the terrorist operation in Israel during the before the independence of Israel, and then continued to be the settlers movement and so on. This is where Begin came from, Shamir. Shamir was a terrorist. Netanyahu's father was the American secretary for Vladimir Jabotinsky. And this is Netanyahu's belief. And they operate from a standpoint which is that the Old Testament is essentially a real estate contract between God and the Jews. And the only question is, how much land did God give the Jews? And the greater Israel belief is that it's all, from the Tigris and the Euphrates to the Nile, it's all Israel. And that's why you see these extremists among the settlers who treat the Palestinians, as they say, as cockroaches, as people who are trying to take over their land. And these are people who will do anything. They use assassination, they use bombings. Just today, the Israeli security forces raided a house, and from what I just heard a little while ago, killed 6 Palestinians who they claimed were armed terrorists who were about to conduct some operation in Israel. Maybe, maybe not. What you find oftentimes is that when you victimize a population enough, as the Israelis have done to the Palestinians, you can create an environment where some of those people can become terrorists, especially if they are brought into networks by the Israelis to put them in contact with people who are advocating violence against Israel. So this is a sort of long prelude to say that there's a difference between what used to be called the moderate nation builder grouping around Ben-Gurion, and that also changed somewhat, but people like Shimon Peres, who is the main influence on the Oslo process. And what Peres said is, you're never going to get peace with the Palestinians unless you have a 2-state solution, but you have to make sure the Palestinian state can function economically. And what Peres arranged, with full support from Rabin, was the economic accords of the Oslo Agreement, which unfortunately were never acted upon, which called for Israel to engage in capital goods transfer, technology transfer, land transfer to the Palestinians to help them set up a modern economy. And who killed Rabin? It was an extremist settler. So, this is the battle inside Israel, where you have people who, basically want to say, well, I don't know how we got here. This is our land now. It's our nation. We want to defend it. But, a large portion of the Israelis would like peace with the Palestinians. But there's also a segment of the Israelis, these greater Israel fanatics, who want all the land. They're the settlers. They want to drive the Palestinians out. And this grouping was there from the beginning of Israel to the present. And unfortunately, this grouping now has support from a whole section of so-called fundamentalist Christians in the United States, who essentially see the people of Israel as fulfilling biblical prophecy. And of course, what's the biblical prophecy? Well, they'll all end up getting killed eventually, but the ones who remain will give up Judaism, become Christians, and it will usher in the return of Jesus. And the Israelis cynically play with this. They use the fundamentalist Christians as part of their ability to manipulate politics in the United States. Now, let me just go back to the British side for a second. The Balfour Declaration, which was essentially the agreement by the British to establish a Jewish state, as I said, there was very little Jewish support for that. Herzl and the Zionist movement, were idealists, dreamers. The early settlers who went there right after World War I were promised a little land, and they were essentially kibbutzniks, socialists who wanted to set up farming communes. But the Balfour Declaration, and Lord Balfour was one of the members of the British cabinet, was based on this idea that everywhere the British could go in the Middle East after the war should be an area where they can stir up trouble that will keep the British presence inevitable. And you see this, for example, with Lawrence of Arabia, who promoted Arab nationalism to get rid of the Turks in the Arabian Peninsula, but then they turned it over to Ibn Saud and the nomadic tribesmen that became the leaders of Saudi Arabia. They used terrorism against the Turks to drive the Ottomans out. This is a British project that goes back to the 1870s, when they talked about Turkey as the sick man of Europe. How can you drive the Ottoman Empire out of the Middle East and create a basis for British control? This was before everyone was either aware of the volume of oil that was there, or before oil was even that necessary for the fleets and other things that later used it. It was a geopolitical decision. And so the Jewish people that were sent to Israel became pawns of this British geopolitical project, just as the Ukrainians are pawns of it today, as the Muslim versus Hindu fight in the Indian subcontinent was manipulated by the British. And so you can't really separate this out without seeing the British hand. Now, is that still relevant? Well, yeah, because the Five Eyes represent an extremely powerful organizing force of intelligence. And the Mossad, you might say, would be the sixth eye. The Mossad functions very closely with them. The Mossad has been integrated into cyber operations, military training exercises. The French gave the Israelis the nuclear technology to develop the Israeli nuclear capability. So, without the Anglo-French and then later the Americans moving in, Israel would probably be less of a difficult place on the planet than it is today. Now, one thing on the United States-Israel relationship. In 1956, the British and the French and the Israelis invaded Egypt. Now, this was right after the non-aligned conference held their Bandung conference in Indonesia in 1955, and were moving to establish the idea of a group of nations that were not part of the East Bloc or the West Bloc, that were outside of the Cold War. And the decision was made in London, we've got to break this up. And one of the countries they targeted was Egypt. Another one was Indonesia. And in Egypt, the British organized the French and the Israelis to attack Egypt. This was the so-called Suez Crisis in 1956. Now, what was the U.S. response? The British thought the U.S. would come in and back them. Eisenhower instead told the British to get the hell out of Egypt. And he threatened them. He basically said there will be sanctions, the pound will be unleashed, we'll cut off the ability of the pound to be transferred to dollars if you don't get out of Egypt. And sure enough, tail between the legs, the British left. But the Israelis had a sense then that if they undertook, at least a section in Israel, that if they undertook actions to consolidate their control of territory, they would have support from the West. And this was a battle after the 67 war. How much will Israel keep? The 73 war. And since that time, we've seen a growing expansion of Israel and the establishment of what one could best describe as a Warsaw Ghetto type situation in Gaza and other areas of the West Bank, where the Palestinians have very little rights. Their income is controlled by Israel. Their water is controlled by Israel. If there's any disturbances, they're rounded up and jailed or killed. So now, to get to the bigger question, there are some people who will tell you, intelligence people in Europe who will tell you, that the Operation Gladio terror networks in Europe coordinated with the Mossad. That is, the left and right wing terrorists that carried out the Moro kidnapping and assassination, the Bologna train bombing 10 years earlier, the assassination of Alfred Herrhausen, the head of Deutsche Bank, at the time of the fall of the Berlin Wall, when he was going to go with a favorable policy towards Moscow. There are a number of these assassinations, and many people that I know in European intelligence will tell you that while these were essentially NATO operations, there was groundwork and coordination with the Mossad in this. And the Mossad was in Europe for many of those years. There's, of course, a whole heroic legend about how great the Mossad is, but they had their failures. But I think they represent a part of this British imperial geopolitical faction. And sometimes they act on their own. This is what was called the breakaway ally scenario that was dreamed up by the neocons in the United States, who said, maybe we can get Israel to do some of our dirty work. And that meant taking on people who later the US took on, namely the Assad government in Syria, Saddam Hussein and the Ba'ath Party in Iraq, and so on. Because the Israelis, whatever else they are, there are some of them who are realists and don't want to have a war with the entire Arab world. And that's been one of the restraining factors of Israel, probably the only restraining factor on Israel since its creation in 1947. So basically what I'm saying, John, is it's a very complicated picture, but the connections to the Five Eyes intelligence networks, there are Israelis everywhere in the world, Israeli intelligence. And now one of the things that is interesting is NATO is saying to them, you have to help us in Ukraine. You have to move the Iron Dome, let the Ukrainians have access to the Iron Dome, especially now that the Russians are supposedly using Iranian drones. And for their own reasons, the Israelis said no. And it's not necessarily a principle. It's not necessarily that they're saying we don't want to help Nazis, although some are saying that. But it also has to do with the Israel-Russia relationship. Because when you ask, is Israel a sovereign country, the Israelis are basically saying to the United States, but out of our relations with Russia, we're trying to coordinate with Russia to keep Iran under control in Syria and Lebanon. So, as in any place the British left, it's extremely complex.
I would say everywhere that the British left is a better place than it was with the British there. It looks that way to me right now. I have to probe a little bit, and thank you so much for that very detailed. Although I know it, with a little bit of time we have, we can't go into everything. But my recollection is that the Balfour Declaration was actually drafted by Lord Rothschild, and kind of handed to Balfour, saying, "Here, sign this." And that indicates to me that the real control over this is not with the politicians of Britain, but with the bankers of Britain. Your comment on that?
Well, Lord Rothschild was working with Balfour, but I think people sometimes give more power to the Rothschilds than they actually deserve. If you look at the British elite at the turn of the century, 1890, 1910, that period, you had a grouping around Edward VII, the king, who called themselves British Israelites, but they weren't Jewish. They were Christians. Lloyd George was part of that grouping. And this goes back to Edward, who, when he was Prince Albert, had a lot of time on his hands, sort of like Prince Charles. He was waiting for Queen Victoria to die for about 40 years. So he set up something called the Palestine Exploration Fund, which was done in conjunction with Oxford, and something called the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford, which was where modern Freemasonry was hatched. Now, they had this whole theory about the British monarchy and the British elite being the lost tribe of Israel, and that they were destined because of that to rule the world. And Edward VII was one of these crazy oligarchs who believed in this stuff. So that was the milieu in which the Rothschilds were acting. Now, the one thing you know about the Rothschilds is they were very clever in finding the openings to advance their cause, and their cause was building their empire, their financial empire. But every step of the way, they had support of at least one faction of the oligarchy in the countries in which they were operating. So was it the Rothschilds who initiated this? Well, the Rothschilds had a role in it, and they worked very closely with Balfour and others, including Lord Curzon and the India Bureau, which was part of the fight in Saudi Arabia. What became Saudi Arabia was between the India Bureau on the one hand and the Arab Bureau in Cairo on the other. That was the fight between Lawrence of Arabia and St. John Philby, who was the father of the famous triple agent Kim Philby. So again, it's complicated, but the interesting part is that the Herzl, who wrote the so-called founding document of Zionism, Herzl was a somewhat failed drama critic, and he was picked up that the story is by the Rothschilds, but the actual person who selected him was Lloyd George. And this was from his communication with people in Vienna. So, who's the power behind the throne? I think you have to look at this and put aside the real conspiracy theory around the Rothschilds. They definitely play a big role, but it was facilitated by the bigger people behind them, which included the global Masonic order, which included the old European oligarchy. And if you go back a little further, what you find is the reason Jewish bankers became so useful is because some of the Christian kings of Europe believed that usury was a sin. So they figured, let's get the Jews to do it for us.
Sure.
And, to be in personal disclosure, my great-grandfather was what was called a Hofjuden, a court Jew, who was an attorney for the Habsburgs in Budapest. And when his children were about to be drafted into the Austrian army, that's when they came to the United States.
That's absolutely fascinating, and thanks for sharing that. Yeah, well, I just tossed back at you. Number one, there's a writer named Martha Schucard, Schucard, which I would recommend to people that are interested in the relationship between Freemasonry and Judaism going way back. She writes a number of essays and a couple of books. You can find her by her last name. The fascinating relationship between the early Scottish Freemasons and then after that the British Freemasons that had this conceit that they were in fact related to the ancient Israelis.
The Temple of Solomon. That's where they trace their roots.
Exactly, and if
The lost temple.
you look into Masonry, you get right back to that Temple of Solomon and the images from that. It's something that, and then of course we didn't even mention Benjamin Disraeli and his devotion to the the good noble, the idea that we're the good guys that ride through and sort out the good guys from the bad guys. But the Israeli influence on Britain is at least as strong as the British influence on Israel. I guess we can't really sort it out, but it's fascinating to me who was behind. His name is Jabotinsky, I think. Is that right?
Jabotinsky.
I've run into him before. I remember studying him a bit, but I need a recollection. And who would finance a guy like that?
That's an interesting question.
Okay.
He was a protege of a man named Parvis. And Parvis was someone who worked with Lenin and Trotsky, who was from Odessa. And he was a grain merchant. But he was someone who was involved in trying to figure out whether the Jewish population could be used against the Tsar, because he was coordinating with, he was one of the people who arranged for Lenin to get a secret passage on a train through Germany to go from Austria to Finland right before the Russian Revolution. So Parvis is one of the key people who was a talent scout. But what was Parvis's connection? Well, his grain companies were totally involved with British grain trade. And so here he was, a Bolshevik supporter, creating a wing of the Zionist movement, but at the same time hobnobbing in London with the British aristocracy. So it's Parvus. There's not much written about him, but he's a very fascinating character and was tied to people like Sidney Riley, the so-called ace of spies, a number of people who were involved in the Bolshevik Revolution and so on. Again, it's one of these things that is so interconnected. It's hard to pull it apart. And of course, most of these people never told the truth. So you never really knew who they were connected with. But one of the places to start is this Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, which is closed to the public. It's hard to get into. It has all the old Freemasonic texts. I'm told that this is where Bernard Lewis, the Arabist, who was basically the mentor for Brzezinski and the people who are involved in the present day geopolitics in the Middle East, that Bernard Lewis did most of his work in that archive.
Well, I'm getting the very simple idea that simple ideas are always dangerous, but my simple idea is that these British nobility types, or the upper class, maybe the Ascot group or whoever they are right now, are the ones that would say to one part of Israel, say, "Hey, you guys are going to have to be our bad guys. You're going to have to go out and cut the throats for us from time to time, and we'll let you know who to cut. But just know that you're the guys." And that's why this tradition survives. If good, if good people saw what's going on, they would tear down the institutions that are running these Machiavellian murder schemes.
Well, John, let me give you an example ripped from the headlines today. What happened to Liz Truss? What's going on in Great Britain? This Boris Johnson's implosion, then Liz Truss is in for 44 days, and then she's dumped. Now, when you see her in the last days of her prime ministership, she has this befuddled look on her face, like, what's going on here? Because she's someone who checked all the right boxes for the aristocracy. Ukraine war, absolutely for it. Destroy Russia, absolutely for it. She said she's willing to push the nuclear button if necessary. Cut the budget, she's for it. Give huge tax cuts to the wealthiest people, she's all for it. So why did they dump her? Well, because she wasn't effective as a salesman. Boris Johnson had been a good salesman, but he was so corrupt and so much of a liar that even his own friends and allies who were benefiting from his prime ministership didn't trust him anymore. And so they decided not to go to Sunak and instead went with Truss initially. Now they've got Sunak in there. Now, who is this guy? He's one of the richest people in the United Kingdom. His father-in-law runs something called Infosys, I think it's called, which is one of the leading Indian computer artificial intelligence cyber operation. So his wife is the daughter of the person who founded it. The name is Naranya Murthy. So now most of the British will tell you he's not a very charismatic person. So what's his job? His job is to go in there and cut the hell out of the budget. And so when you talk about who benefits from these policies, the people in the United Kingdom are being really sacrificed now almost as much as the Ukrainians. For what reason? The British bankers went way over their heads into derivatives. And they did it because the physical economy of Great Britain is collapsing. It's been deindustrialized more so than the rest of Europe. And the ability to loot was somewhat lost with the Brexit policy. But also the Brits are getting blowback against them from their former colonies. So who do they have to loot? Their population. And who better to oversee it than someone of an Indian origin? So they can say if the poorer people, the immigrants and others who are brought in and work to the bone and don't have money for heat or fuel or dying, they can say, well, don't blame the British. It's this Indian guy who's doing it. So it's typical. It's what one of my British friends calls it, a very British coup that brought down Liz Truss. So, you look at this and then what we were talking about earlier about Israel, these are people who don't think like us. They're concerned with family and personal wealth and power. And you could see that very nakedly in someone like Boris Johnson. In Liz Truss, it wasn't so obvious unless you know her history. She and her Chancellor of the Exchequer, Kwarteng, were allies going back to 2012 when they wrote a book called Britannia Unleashed. And what was it about? A new era of Thatcherism with even more extreme deregulation, privatization, so-called globalist policies. And so she was hardcore committed to this. So they thought they had the person they wanted. But when she got in there, they said, well, let's cut her loose and bring in this guy Sunak, who they had already rejected before twice in favor of Boris Johnson and then Liz Truss.
I think they just did not have enough time to get Liz Truss properly prepped the way they did with Margaret Thatcher. because I think, you know, a little more hairspray, a little bit more diction, and you know, some of that professional training that Thatcher got would have been a great thing, but they didn't have time for it, so they threw her right into the front lines, and she got murdered.
Well, they sacrificed her. They
Okay.
sacrificed her because
Why?
look, they're not going to change their policy. Their policy is going to be they went from quantitative easing to quantitative tightening, and then when they saw that this was going to trigger a derivatives blowout, they went back to quantitative easing. Now they're saying the only way they can live with quantitative easing is if they have dramatic cuts in the budget. Well, the budget in the United Kingdom has been slashed for the last 15 years, especially the last, whatever it is, 8 years with the Tories. Now, how are they going to slash it further? Well, this is where you see Truss actually let the cat out of the bag by saying she wanted to increase the number of immigrants coming into Britain. What? Doesn't that go against the whole idea of Brexit? No, because the establishment wants cheap labor. They want people who will work for almost nothing for the benefit of being able to have fish and chips on a Sunday. So, you know, the whole Truss operation was business as usual for the City of London. And remember, it was the Bank of England that sank her. Andrew Bailey went to the Parliament and said to them that the British bond market's going to collapse if this mini budget is not junked. And since Truss was so connected to so identified with the mini budget, they had to dump her.
They had to junker dumper.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Unceremoniously.
But you know, and your reference to Mr. Sunak reminds me so much of our colleague Professor Daryl Hamamoto's book Servitors of Empire, in which he described a similar use of Asians by the British Empire and the American Empire, and how you know how much of what's going on now in terms of the devotion of our Asian families to technical things, math, science, physics, rocketry, engineering, it surpasses that of most American students by leaps and bounds, so much that these folks are in a position to provide the technical know-how, but have not had that Renaissance education of learning the things, the perspective that people like you have on, well, geez, if we do this, what are the consequences, you know, and who's really telling me to do this? And, you know, we can talk about all this weird experimentation that's going on, this Boston variant that they've created in a lab. Who in their right mind would want to create a virus that you can't stop, and it defeats the human immune system, and yet they do these things. They either don't have a conscience, or they've been provided with something that's just so compelling that they go ahead and do it anyway, or else they're just plain so stovepiped in their career that they don't look beyond the fact that they'll get a bonus if they create this particular monster that they keep working on. I
I think
find.
it's a factor of all those things, John. And I think what we're looking at, though, if you can get let's get a little bit higher up and look at survey the whole strategic situation right now. The collapse is really escalating in the West. The City of London, the United Kingdom, is one example of how far it's gone. We're seeing the potential for ungovernability in France. We see Macron and Schultz now fighting. There's a break of since de Gaulle and Adenauer, the basis of Europe has been France and Germany, but there's a battle underway. You know, the Germans, if they ever get over being so stupid, they'll realize that the blowing up of the Nord Stream pipelines was targeting the people of Germany, that the war in Ukraine was not only against Russia, but against Germany, to have Germany be broken permanently from any alliance with Russia. And so you have the winters coming here in Germany. I was talking with the father of one of my daughter's friends the other day, who's a policeman in Berlin, and I asked him, what's he hearing about the coming winter? And he said, we're spending all our time making sure that the centers where people can go when there are blackouts will be safe. This is what they're training for in Berlin right now. Now what's happening with the population? Well, finally, we're seeing a break away from the major parties. The two most popular politicians in the polls in Germany right now, one is Markus Söder, the minister-president of Bavaria, who's the head of the Christian Social Union, which is the so-called conservative wing of the CDU, the Christian Democrats, and Sarah Wagenknecht, the far-left leader of the far-left party, the Linkspartei, which is trying to throw her out because she's saying maybe we should work with the conservatives. So you have the two most popular figures in parties that are out of the government. The support for the Greens is continuing because the Germans are brainwashed, but at the same time, as they say, we need more alternative energy, they're also saying, but we don't want the war. So you have people marching in Italy, no to war, no to NATO. In France, no to the EU. In Germany, they're calling for peace talks. And now you see, finally, some German politicians saying, let's get together, let's find a neutral location and have a discussion. But it's pretty late in the game because the financial system is very far gone right now. And the Financial Times had an article 2 days ago where they wrote about this roundtable, the European roundtable that does an analysis of the economy. And what it said is the deindustrialization of Europe has leaped ahead of expectations because of the effects of the war and the COVID crisis and the Green New Deal. Now, for the most part, it's not Putin who caused this. All of this was in place before anything happened in Ukraine. It's the policies of the World Economic Forum and Klaus Schwab. But who is Schwab? Schwab is a functionary of the British Empire. I'm sure you've seen these pictures of him at Davos with then Prince Charles at his side all the time. Schwab's policies were written by the people who write the speeches for Prince Charles, now King Charles. Charles was the leading advocate of deindustrialization of Europe, second only to his psychotic father, Prince Philip. So, what we're seeing now is the unraveling of 100 years, 150 years of science and technology. And we're starting to see the same thing that we're seeing in the United States, a lowering of the life expectancy. And the main cause of that is young people who are dying. And the major cause of those dying is drugs and suicides. So we're seeing a loss of hope, a demoralization of a whole population. And what happens in a country like Germany where the discrepancy of the old people to the young people makes it impossible for enough people working to produce the money to keep the old people alive? Either you kill them off or you bring in huge numbers of immigrants to work. And that's the problem they have in Europe right now. They can't figure out which way to go. Now, while this is happening, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the BRICS are growing. You know who's joining the BRICS now? The Saudis. I'm sure many of your viewers were somewhat shocked when the Saudis told Biden to get lost, when Biden said, you have to increase your oil production. And the Saudis said, well, we're almost up to full capacity, but we coordinate with OPEC plus. Who's the plus in OPEC plus? Russia. So Prince MBS is coordinating with Putin now. He's coordinating with the South Africans. We're seeing this thing we've been talking about, the emergence of the global South, is taking off right now. Regional currency blocks, multilateral trade agreements, and essentially a willingness to say to the so-called advanced sector, we're not going to listen to you anymore. So we're in a period of transformation between two systems, a collapsing imperial monetarist policy and the emergence of the Asian century centered around physical economic investment. What you were just talking about, engineering, science, spacecraft, new technologies. The question is, where will the West go? Will the West try and stop it? Or will enough people wake up in the West and realize it's time that this is not something that's an attack on the West, it's something that we can work with? And just a final note on this. I don't know if you saw this. Did you happen to see the intervention that a couple of my colleagues did on AOC
I
around the
did,
war?
yes, and I've relished it and shared it myself. Tell us about it.
Well, these are two young people, Kynan Thistlethwaite and Jose Vega, who are LaRouche youth members. And Jose is from AOC's district. And he was particularly effective because what he said is that I supported you. I believed in you. And now you're joining the people you said you were going to fight. You're funding Nazis in Ukraine. And this, of course, was viral. 25 million views of the video of this. Now, that was last week. You know what happened yesterday? 30 progressive Democrats signed a letter to Biden saying it's time now for the United States to push for negotiations. And you know who one of the signers was? AOC. And after Jose intervened on her, all she could do was stand up there in front of the room saying, "You're rude, you're very rude." And now she's gone along with what he said. What's the lesson? Don't be quiet. Speak up. If there's enough of a clamor for a change in policy, even corrupt politicians like AOC or like the Republican minority leader in the House, McCarthy. What did McCarthy say? After the election, he thinks the Republicans are going to be less willing to support the Ukraine war. So now we're seeing a potential of anti-war Democrats and anti-war Republicans coming together. Now, will they get the point that the reason we're going to war against Russia is because our economy is collapsing and the people who run it are trying to destroy the rivals? Will they get it? Well, that's our job. We've got to, as people wake up, we've got to direct them with ideas and policy. So I just want to announce that Thursday, the Schiller Institute is sponsoring a dialogue among former elected officials, mostly from Latin America and Africa, who are going to take up the question of what would be the basis of a new financial system based on LaRouche's idea of physical economy. And so people can find that at the schillerinstitute.com. It's an online conference. It's taking place in the Mexican Chamber of Deputies, that is basically the Mexican Congress. And it's open for anybody, and you'll have a chance to see people sitting down and discussing what's in the real interests of sovereign nations in the Southern Hemisphere and why this is an opportunity for countries that presently are going to war to defend bankrupt banks to drop that and join these countries.
Well, thank you very much, and kudos to Jose and his partner there. And I did share that, and I think everyone else could too. That the effect of young voices in public telling, just speaking their mind, speaking their truth.
Yeah,
that's all it is. And when the truth is there, it stands clear, as the Muslims say. The truth stands clear from error.
mm.
I think, if we keep working in this direction, enough people will rise up and stand up. That they can't assassinate everybody, but they sure have assassinated a lot of people.
Yeah.
And it sure is chilling. And like I say, I mean, it kept me unsettled last night and this morning, just thinking about I won't go into it now, but it is a deeply personal concern. I'll just put that much out there, because I know the history, from my father, and I know what's happened in my family, and I know what's happened to me in my life. And it's chilling to just think about it, but it is absolutely real. So the
Mhm.
question is, are we going to stand up as free people? I think they made a big mistake when they allowed the United States of America to come into existence. They probably thought they could control it from the instant that it got free, and they probably thought that this idea of individual rights, well, that's just useful to us to get the revolution, storm the Bastille, and let's create the chaos, the world that we can then form in our own new world order way. We'll be the phoenix rising from the ashes, but first let's just create the ashes by being destructive, and we see through it now. We understand how it works, but the people of the United States, we don't understand the way they think. That is a big problem. We are these golden rule people. We think I'm going to treat you the way I want you to treat me, and that rule applies all around the world and to all the nations of the world, that we're going to be kind and good to each other, and that's the way that life is. And we have to wake up and say, no, that's not the way a great portion of the world, especially the old world, looks at life. And as you described it, it's all about, what can I do for my family? What can I do to preserve my wealth? How can I prevent some disaster happening to my personal uh, uh, kingdom? Uh, and and that selfishness is pervasive of the policies of people that oppose freedom, that oppose individual rights, and are afraid of us.
Well,
And
John, just to go back to your point about the American Revolution, remember the British tried to stop it.
yeah,
They sent their troops. They sent paid German mercenaries over here to fight. And after the American Revolution, they tried to subvert it from within, up to and including the assassination of Alexander Hamilton, who was the primary economic thinker behind what enabled the United States to get out from under Revolutionary War debt and start to build an independent nation. The British thought if they could sabotage Hamilton's bank and force the United States to adopt a British style private central bank, they could control the United States. After Aaron Burr killed Hamilton, where did he go? He went to London. He moved in with Jeremy Bentham, who was a paid philosopher working for the British East India Company. So, the history is clear. The problem is Americans don't know history, or they don't think it's so important. And so you have well-meaning people who call themselves patriotic Americans who love the founding fathers, who say, well, Hamilton was a banker. Hamilton wanted the British system. It's not true. It's the British who created that whole narrative so that Americans wouldn't know our real heritage. And this is one of the things that LaRouche was committed to his whole life, getting people to dig into the research, into the original documents, and read them and think about them. Think about how those people thought about what they were doing, so that we can develop our own minds and our own character. Because you can't just take what they did and apply it 100%. It's the question of how do you have a scientific advance based on universal principles. And the way you do it is you go through the process of those who came before you and made these discoveries. And that's what I've committed my life to, not just for me, but to teach that. And people like Jose and Kynan, who did this intervention, that's the kind of thing I was doing 40 years ago. I was dragged out of more meeting rooms than you could count. And I'm proud to say that we have young people who are not so glued to social media that they're afraid to stand up and confront someone who's as big a celebrity as AOC.
Harley Schlanger, what a treasure you are, and all of your colleagues at the LaRouche Organization and the Schiller Institute. I read old articles from Executive Intelligence Review just about every day, and if you want to dig into the history, just go there at larouchepub.com and start reading. It's a a real treasure trove, and you'll never get it in a standard history book. Harley, thank you so much for this morning. I look forward to the next time, and all the best with all of your many projects.
Thank you, John. See you in 2 weeks.
All right. Thanks, everyone.